I actually remember a board meeting with one of our early investors who, when I said, hey, this kid's business is just okay, but I think the biggest opportunity is in women's, he was like, I don't know what you guys are thinking. You guys are idiots. Like, you haven't even cracked this thing. Now you're trying to do this other thing. You're out of your mind. And, then obviously like a year or two later, he's like, that was the best decision you ever made.
I knew it all along.
Yeah.
I told you it was going to work.
If you think your business is hard, try transforming an entire industry. That's what today's guest, James Reinhart, the founder and CEO of ThredUp, is trying to do. Fashion is one of the leading polluters and sources of waste in the world. And James Reinhart and ThredUp have been pioneers in changing consumer behavior to think secondhand first, to reuse clothing instead of throwing it away, and to monetize the massive inventory of clothes we all have in our closets that are never being worn. He's built this company in a different way. They've been pioneers of the 4-day work week. They have a very cohesive culture. And he's one of the foremost thinkers about how fashion can be a leader in ecological sustainability as well as economic performance. Today, ThredUp is a publicly traded company. And just to give you a sense of the size, in the first quarter of 2024, generated $80 million in revenue. In our conversation, James tells the whole founding story from being in a classroom at the Harvard Business School all the way through the IPO and running the company as a public company CEO. He's seen a lot in the intervening time: stock markets, highs and lows, valuations, investors who believed and didn't believe. And he's had a really daunting and difficult challenge. We talk a lot in this episode about how harder is easier. Sometimes by tackling a challenge in a harder way, by solving the problem for customers in a more fulsome way, even though it's more logistically difficult, you get these counterintuitive advantages: a talent recruiting advantage, a competitive advantage, better investors, and quite a few other surprises. So in this conversation, I hope you'll see why there's this emerging movement of CEOs who are thinking about how to build companies in a different way. I hope you'll enjoy this conversation with James Reinhart. I've started a lot of companies, and I've helped a lot more people start companies too. And therefore, I've had a lot of banks and a lot of bank accounts. And so I'm really delighted that this episode is brought to you by Mercury, the company I trust for startup banking. Every time someone on my team uses their Mercury Link debit card, I get an email with the details. And just that little bit of financial intelligence, always in my inbox, gives me a much clearer understanding of what we're spending. That's what Mercury is like through all its financial workflows. They're all powered by the bank account. Everything's automatic. And for those of us that remember the recent banking crisis, Mercury was there for a lot of startups who needed them. They've since launched features like Mercury Treasury and Mercury Vault with up to $5 million in FDIC insurance through their partner bank and their sweep networks. Certain conditions must be satisfied for pass-through FDIC insurance to apply. Apply in minutes at mercury.com and join over 100,000 ambitious startups that trust Mercury to get them performing at their best. Mercury, the art of simplified finances. Mercury is a financial technology company, not a bank. Banking services provided by Choice Financial Group and Evolve Bank and Trust, members FDIC. This episode is brought to you by DigitalOcean, the cloud loved by developers and founders alike. Developing and deploying applications can be tough, but it doesn't have to be. Scaling a startup can be a painful road, but it doesn't have to be. When you have the right cloud infrastructure, you can skip the complexity and focus on what matters most. DigitalOcean offers virtual machines, managed Kubernetes, plus new solutions like GPU compute. With a renewed focus on ensuring excellent performance for users all over the world, DigitalOcean has the essential tools developers need for today's modern applications, with the predictable pricing that startups want. Join the more than 600,000 developers who trust DigitalOcean today, with $200 in free credits and even more exclusive offers just for listeners at do.co/Eric. Terms and conditions apply.
All right, James, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Thanks for coming to the show. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I thought maybe we start with, I think we first met, you were still at Harvard Business School. It's like,
I think so. Yeah.
Quite a while ago. So maybe just start talking about being an entrepreneur, at HBS. What was it like, being at Harvard? Just give us a little bit of that backstory.
Yeah, I think I did the classic HBS pit dive where you were in some class and I sort of rushed down to be like the eager entrepreneur. Hey, Eric, I think you're really great. So I do think that's actually how we met. And look, I think being at HBS this is 2006 to '09, it wasn't really peak entrepreneurship there.
Yeah.
Right? I think even in your sort of, early emergent phase with the lean startup, right? It was very early. And so most of my friends at that time were going to be bankers and consultants and do all the normal stuff. And the entrepreneurs were, in the basement. But I think at that time it became, because it was a small and mighty group, there was a lot of camaraderie across the number of entrepreneurs who were there, and then shortly thereafter. And so you actually had this group of hardcore entrepreneurs, and I think that helped us sort of hold together and support one another, right? At a time when it wasn't as cool to be an entrepreneur as maybe it is today.
I've been rushed by a lot of people on a lot of stages over the years, but very few of them go on to become CEOs of public companies. So you're in a very select group.
Yeah. That Venn diagram would look really weird. Yeah.
No, it's really great. Why did you go to Harvard?
I was a joint degree student. So I did the Kennedy School of Government and then at HBS. And before school, I was a teacher, and then I helped run and work at a public charter school called Pacific Collegiate. And at the time, I was very, very much obsessed with education policy, and so I was very passionate about the relationship between public and private partnerships. I was very interested about the role of government in stimulating new ways for students to learn, innovation. I became very interested in the charter school movement. And so that really drew me to, where can I go and be steeped in a little bit of pedagogy around how does this all work? And I was a history and philosophy major as an undergrad. And so there was a bunch of stuff I just didn't know. I didn't know how to do. And I thought business school, Kennedy School, policy, business would be a great fit. So that's really how I ended up at school. I think the little known fact, though, about that is I actually didn't get in to Harvard Business School the first time I applied. I got into the Kennedy School, and HBS was like, sorry, and so I had this moment of, well, do I still want to do this? And the answer was yes. And so I went to the Kennedy School, and I think maybe indicative of my entrepreneurial, learn from failure, I reapplied with an entirely new approach to my application, and then I got in, and it was a great experience.
A harbinger of things to come.
Yeah, maybe I don't know. Yeah.
When did you decide you wanted to be an entrepreneur?
I'm not sure I don't know. I'd be curious your take on this. I don't know whether you decide or it just becomes obvious that like this is the thing you're pretty good at. And so I think it became obvious that I was pretty good at it, early in the ThredUp, journey, where I just became resilient and passionate and not taking no for an answer and being willing to do crazy things to kind of secure a positive outcome. And so I think that was really the moment where I guess I knew. But I think that there's the story that I like to tell about when I think I kind of owned up to it is I was in my second year, and Brian Spaley, who I don't know if you know Brian, but Brian was the co-founder of Bonobos and with Andy Dunn. And Brian came to campus to talk about founding Bonobos. And similarly, I befriended him and I said, Brian, I need some advice. I'm working on this thing. It's used clothes. It's the internet. He's like, And he said to me basically like, well, I don't know whether your idea is any good or not. But what I do know is that you should give yourself another semester to try. And he put it so thoughtfully. He's like, what if you were just on the slow plan at HBS? Instead of doing your degree in 4 semesters, it took you 5. And he said, think about this as another semester, right? And school ends in May. He said, give yourself through the end of the year. And I so have valued that advice because I think if Brian hadn't made it okay for me to be on the slow plan, so to speak, and take another semester, I don't know if I would have stuck with it. But he gave me permission. And I often sort of share that with entrepreneurs, giving you permission to take that 6 months and fail epically, or maybe something works out.
A lot of us have had that experience. And what's interesting about your story, I always talk about how entrepreneurship really at its root is a journey of self-discovery. Like you discover things about yourself that you didn't know when you began the journey. And people find this hard to believe. And I think you've done this. I've do the same thing when I tell the story. So I asked you when you knew you were an entrepreneur, but you didn't know until after you already had a company up and running.
Yeah.
So I want to rewind the tape a little bit because just talk about what it was like to not be sure if you were or were not and to do it anyway. Like you went, how did you go from teacher, public policy to starting ThredUp? ThredUp's pretty far afield. Like from the outside, you might seem like, oh, you've traveled a far distance to go from point A to point B. So yeah, just talk about that.
Look, I think on the outside, yes, it looks like it might be a pretty far afield, but when you peel the onion a little bit, I think you find some commonalities to what I was doing for 25 years or 28 years before I started ThredUp. I was always immensely interested in how to make the world a better place. So I think like from the very beginning, I cared about making a difference, making and creating impact. I think when I graduated from Boston College, with a 4-year degree, I was a reasonably good student. I had other job offers, and instead I decided I wanted to be a teacher, and because I wanted to make a difference, right? And I took a job working part-time for $24,000 a year because I wanted to make a difference and have impact. And so there's obviously a through line there with what I've done with ThredUp. I was always very comfortable in front of people, rallying people, inspiring people, convincing people that like what I was working on mattered. And as you know, right, like entrepreneurship is from the very beginning, you are selling every day, right? And so I think there was a through line of I was good at convincing people that I wasn't crazy and that my ideas were worth sort of supporting. And then I think the emergent thing for me as an entrepreneur was that like you could make a living, right? Doing something that you were really mission driven about that then played to your natural skills as a leader. And as I'm even saying it out loud, like you start to see these through lines of like, oh, I can make a difference. That's cool. I can play to my strengths where like leading people and inspiring teams, like that's a huge strength of mine. Like being able to see the big picture and kind of, I hate the phrase like see around corners, but like, yeah, like a little bit, like I think I'm a pretty good interpreter of like trend. And the third is, and I can make a living doing those things. Like that sounds great. And so I never started ThredUp thinking it would be public someday, but I did believe it would make a difference. I did believe I would be good at it. And I did believe I could make some money at some point doing it. And so that's probably like the best synopsis of that journey to ThredUp.
So tell me the ThredUp story.
Oh man. The story is, as I said, I was a teacher. I went to business school. That is shorthand for a guy who has a lot of debt and no money. And so I woke up one day, and I had always been a guy who had, bought clothes and liked to have things, reasonably stylish things. And I had all these clothes that I wasn't really wearing. I was like, well, this stuff has value. Let me just go sell this stuff, and then I can use that for whatever I was doing at the time. And I went to the local consignment store on Mass Ave in Cambridge, second time around, which we should come back to because there's an interesting story there. I went second time around, and I brought the stuff, and I said, hey, this is stuff I need to sell. And they said, well, we don't take this stuff. I was like, what do you mean you don't take this? I'm staring at a whole store full of this stuff. What do you mean you don't take it? And they're like, oh, well, we don't really do men's. Mm-hmm. And we just do more luxury brands. And it was a J. Crew cashmere sweater. It was a Brooks Brothers coat. And I was like, it can't be worth zero. And so commensurate with that, so I went home with all my stuff. And commensurate with that, I was in a class called, I think it was called Strategic Markets and Technology, or it was something to that effect. And it was fundamentally about market mismatches, like how do markets fail? And I thought, well, this is a great example of, I'm sure there's a buyer out there who would love this stuff. And I'm a seller who wants to sell this stuff. And the problem is there's no mechanism for it to kind of work. So that was the real insight. And I remember actually just a few days later going to a bar with some buddies. And after a couple of drinks, I was pitching them the story. And I was, so to the entrepreneurial like genes, I was starting to sell. I'm like, I got this idea. I'm going to sell it to you. Like, what do you think? And I just became obsessed with it. And we started with something that I knew well, which was men's clothing. And we started with trying to create a peer-to-peer experience, a men's shirt swapping service, which in retrospect, was just a terrible idea. Well, not even in retrospect. It was obvious just a few months later, it was a terrible idea. But the instinct was that there was this inefficient market between buyers and sellers, and there needed to be a better way. And I think from there, we went from swapping men's shirts to the feedback I consistently heard, which was, oh, that's a neat idea. I wouldn't use it, right? Which is really code for you. This is not a good idea. But I would use it for my kids. And so very quickly we were like, kids market. Like that's a market where there's forced obsolescence, right? If you're a parent, kids are growing, you got to get rid of this stuff, right? You're living this right now. And so we moved to the kids market. Our first tagline was clothes don't grow, kids do. And that's kind of how we got started. And I can kind of keep going to where we are today, or we can talk about that early.
Well, that's actually a great pivot story already right there. How long did it take you to figure out that the first MVP was no good?
It took basically the spring. So call it February, March through June, 3-4 months. Yeah. And there was I'll tell you, so our friend, our mutual friend, Tom Eisman, was very instrumental in that first pivot, because he said to me, I went into his office and said, I'm working on this thing. He said, James, I said, well, how will I know if the sample size for what I'm working on is big enough? This is 2009, mind you. So the numbers are very different for the audience listening today of what the right sample size is. But then he said to me, well, you need 10,000 people using it. I was like, what? 10,000? I had 300 at the time, right? He's like, if you can't get 10,000 people using something sort of right, in its early adoption phase, you're not going to get reliable data. And I just could not believe that. And by God, he was totally right, because we pivoted out of shirts, we launched kids, and in a few months we had 10,000 people using it. And then we started to get really interesting data around that use case and where we would go from there.
People always think iteration, pivots, MVPs, this is all about the local maximum, but that's such a great illustration that you could add all the features you want to the men's shirt swap, and you could work on that for the rest of your life, and you might never get 10,000. Just the contrast when you finally have something that's working, the difference. It's for people who haven't experienced it, it's so obvious that now your experiments are being more productive. Now you're making some progress. You get there, but it can be hard to let go of the idea and be willing to do the next thing.
Yeah, and I think you really do have to really hold space in your brain for a product that can work, product market fit, and a big market. And because I think the next pivot was kids is interesting. There's obviously a product market fit of a use case of kids outgrowing stuff. But what you find when you then dig into it is that the kids market is much, much smaller than people think, because the informal hand-me-down market is so robust. And so when you think about markets and companies that invent new markets, there's a whole sort of point of view around are you taking a gray market, turning it into a real market opportunity. And what we found in the kids business was that our product worked very well for a subset, right? But that the informal work in the market did the job, right? To sort of Christensen's job theory. It actually did the job pretty well. My guess is, I don't know, how old are you? How old's your oldest now?
10.
Chances are you got enough people in your life at 9, 8, 7 that it works okay. It's not perfect.
Yep. It's very hard. It's hard to get 10x better of something that works okay.
Yeah. And so I think what we then realized was kids was interesting, but when you then went to a thrift store or you went to a consignment store, by and large, it was full of women's clothes. There was a kids section, there was a men's section, but 90% of the store was a women's section. And then you're like, now I see what's happening here. And I think then we pivoted into the women's market. But that took about 18 months to 2 years. We raised money against the kids business. And we really had something there. It just wasn't the big business that I thought we could build.
People always think pivots are about failure, but it's actually much harder to pivot out of something that's working, but just where the market opportunity is not where you want it to be.
Yep.
How did you feel having to give up something that was working for the unproven thing that was not?
I think that I made the sin that many entrepreneurs make in the beginning, which is I tried to do both. I tried to straddle.
You're in the club.
No.
We've all done it. Everyone's
right.
done
Like
it.
I feel like it's like a rite of passage, right? And any entrepreneur who doesn't admit to that is lying to themselves. So I tried to have it both ways. We'll do kids and and I actually remember a board meeting with one of our early investors who, when I said, "Hey, this kids business is just okay, but I think the biggest opportunity is in women's," he was like, I don't know what you guys are thinking. You guys are idiots. Like, you haven't even cracked this thing. Now you're trying to do this other thing. You're out of your mind. And then obviously like a year or two later, he's like, that was the best decision you ever made.
I knew it all along.
Yeah.
I told you it was going to work.
No, to his credit, he was like, that's why I'm a venture investor and you're an entrepreneur.
You know, that's very rare actually, but kudos, whoever that investor is, they get the psychic shout out. That is extremely rare.
Yeah.
To have the self-awareness to say that.
Yeah. And I think, I can tell you it's Dan Nova at Highland Capital. And I think Dan gets a lot of credit for, he's willing to be like, you're crazy, but I'm willing to back you because I'm backing you, and your instinct.
That's one of the marks of a great investor. It's actually hard for people who've never done that to imagine.
Yeah. And a few times Dan, it's like since where Dan has like pushed me on something and he's been right to kind of, and pushes me in ways that I think have been really good. So there is a really healthy, VC entrepreneur dynamic. Like when it works, as you know, right? When it works well, it can be extraordinary. When it works poorly, it's a disaster.
That we've all lived through that too.
Yeah.
Let me just ask one more question going back. What I think is really interesting about this story is you started with men's and kids and then made to women's. But I think a lot of people, I can imagine some of your classmates must have said this to you at the time. Like the women's clothing market is obviously so much bigger.
Yeah.
Like, why didn't you just start with that?
I think, so I'm sure that people gave me that advice. I think I probably at the time had blinders on around the kids business and the men's business. And then I think as you raise money against a strategy, right? As I raised money against a kids business, everything was measured against that. And so it was harder to kind of break out.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in the early days, I'm guessing I was more of the like, that's you might be right, but I'm going to do this thing. And
I guess the reason I ask is, do you think you would have been able to appreciate the benefits of being in that market if you hadn't had the prior experience of hitting your head against the wall of a market that's too small?
That's a really good question. I don't know if it would be if banging my head against the wall with kids and men's would have made or having gotten to women's faster would have ultimately made a difference to where we were. I will say that I think it made me get conviction that I wanted to be an entrepreneur and that I was willing to sort of like fight my way through it to figure out how to get the best product and the best market to kind of fit together. So I think I often talk about like just the battle scars of those periods. They did actually, to your point, like steel me for the future. And I think actually like sort of derivative to that is probably the biggest pivot we made was when we started to take on inventory. So
that was very like counter cyclical or counter the dominant of asset light businesses, and everyone thought we were going to live in a world where companies didn't have to have inventory anymore.
Yeah.
So what was it like to be a contrarian on that point?
Well, that was definitely the contrarian move that I think actually is the biggest sort of like switch in that I think has made ThredUp into the company today, which is, and it's part of the customer discovery process of where the friction points were, which was the friction wasn't that people wanted to get rid of their stuff, right? Like we all give away stuff to Goodwill all the time. The friction point that I think we got right, and I think continue to get right, is that people want it to be super easy and convenient, but they do want some economic value for it. And the idea of just dropping stuff off at Goodwill willy-nilly, when you probe people of like, oh, well, that's what you do today. How good do you feel when you do that? Nobody's like, you know what? I feel amazing. Everyone's like, well, that's just what I do. And I think we kept poking and prodding at well, why do you do that? I'm like, well, there isn't really any other way for me to do that. And so I think the ability for us to then invent the clean out kit, the bag, and start to process the inventory was very contrarian at the time. And if you'll indulge me, I'll tell you two like funny stories about that. One is Tim Haley, who is like one of the greatest investors of all time, sits on my board today, very early at Netflix. He invested in the business pre-owning inventory. And I took him around the distribution center, this very small distribution center that we had built in San Francisco, 9,000 square feet in San Francisco. And I showed him all these clothes. And he said, he just laughed. He was like, man, James, I would never have invested in this business if you had shown me this. But then now that I showed him how the customer was responding, he's like, but I'm so glad this is the direction that we took, because ultimately the customer experience was much, much better on both sides of the platform. So it's kind of funny how you're right. The asset light was definitely in vogue. That's how people were raising money, but it ultimately wasn't solving the customer problem. And so I give Tim, again, a lot of like credit for just being like, and then he was very instrumental in the future capital that we raised. And then the other funny story of where like you need to spend time with other entrepreneurs, because other entrepreneurs have insights that you may not have about your business. Before I ever like did a thing for ThredUp, raised any money, I met with a guy who you might be familiar with named Lloyd Tabb. Lloyd was most recently, he has a new company, but most recently he was sort of chief technical officer, co-founder at Looker, which was a great company that everybody uses now, that's now owned by Google. And Lloyd was a Santa Cruz guy, and I met him through working at these schools. And I sat down with Lloyd in the fall of like 2008, sort of holiday of 2008. And I sat down with him like, hey, I'm working on this thing. I'm going to do shirts and blah, blah, right? Give him the whole pitch. What do you think? And he was like, I don't know. I think it's a pretty bad idea. He's like, what's a good idea? Why don't I just send you all my shit and you just take care of it for me? Like, do everything. He's like, be like online Goodwill. And I was like, that's a terrible idea. But it's funny, right? Because his instinct was exactly right, which was the customer problem was do it for me. And I had too many blinders on at that moment to sort of see that insight. But I have such a laugh now, and because Lloyd and I have become friends, that Lloyd really gets some of the credit for founding ThredUp.
So I want to take you back to the idea that you wanted to have impact and positive impact. That was such a motivator for you to become an entrepreneur, because I think you were the first person to ever talk to me about the environmental impact of clothing and clothes production, the importance of secondhand clothing as an environment. If you had asked me at that time whether this could be an impact business, a positive business, I would have said it's just clothing. Who cares?
Yeah.
So I think like I certainly didn't see it. I'm curious what it was like. I mean, obviously you've spent a lot of time thinking and talking about this, but talk to me about like what was your insight on the impact you thought you could have at that time, and like was that part of your original motivation, or did that come later?
Yeah, I will admit it was not part of the original motivation for the business. I was very motivated by sort of the market inefficiency of the business. And I think implicit in that was that like there's waste in the system, but I to be totally honest, it was not a mission play from the outset. It was a market inefficiency sort of insight. I think what quickly became clear though, as we started to get clothes in, process clothes, just how much waste, so it really was 2011, so 2 years after the founding into 2012, where we started to see the waste stream of just how much stuff was coming back that we just couldn't even resell, couldn't reuse because it had been broken down. And I think that was the moment where I started to go deeper on, man, where does all this stuff go? Right? Like what? And a big part of our story from 2012 on was this stuff is ending up in landfills. There's massive overproduction. And it wasn't because, and I think that Goodwill as being the place where a lot of us have given our stuff over the years, to no fault of Goodwill's, about 70% of the sort of apparel right? Cloth that gets donated to them ends up in a landfill. And they're doing the best they can. There's just so much stuff. And the sort of supply chains and infrastructure just does not exist to process that amount of stuff. So I think beginning in 2012, 2013, we started to say, hey, actually, we can really change the way the secondhand apparel market works because we can build infrastructure to get stuff out of people's homes, repurpose it, resell it, and be a real complement to what's happening offline. And I think that, Eric, is when I started to get much more inspired by the mission. And then when you start to kind of go deeper and you see where all that clothing is going in Africa, or you see where it's going in a Chilean desert, it just makes you really sad, right? Around just how wasteful it is. And I think the thing I did not appreciate also was that we have gotten comfortable as Americans about the stuff we give away ending up in landfills, but it doesn't end up in landfills in the US, right? Most of it ends up in landfills in other countries. And now look, there's economic benefits of clothing being exported, and we can talk about that if it's interesting. But I do think at the end of the day, there's overproduction. There aren't great systems to recycle and resell, and that's what we got excited about.
So tell me what the mission of ThredUp is.
I mean, I think our mission is to the mission is to inspire the world to think secondhand first. And that mission has been, and when we say secondhand first, we really want people to, on the seller side, because I think it's buyers and sellers. On the seller side, it's that the minute your clothing becomes no longer useful to you, the answer isn't keep burying it in your closet until it becomes not useful to anyone and it's covered in, and it's got moths eating away at it. But the minute you're like, oh, then you're just like, oh, secondhand, I should just put it back in the service of secondhand. I can sell it. I can sell it myself. I can send it to ThredUp. I can do something with it. So bringing agency to the seller point of view. And then for buyers, like my dream is that we'll live in a world where your instinct for your 10-year-old when you need a new thing is, well, let me just see if there's something secondhand available. And it doesn't mean you're going to buy everything secondhand, but that you have that instinct of, I should just check. And I think what I want to sort of see, the change I kind of want to see in the world is, there was a time we didn't recycle. And now, like, you go to places that don't recycle, you're like, what are these people doing, right? Like it's become so anathema to like how we live in the world. And I want people to have that same experience in secondhand apparel, where it's just kind of crazy that you would not put your stuff back in and be circular. And it's just kind of crazy you wouldn't at least consider finding something secondhand. And to me, that would be a massive, massive home run.
We all live in this very consumerist society where, with all this overproduction and the environmental consequences, I mean, we could do the ethical issues in the supply chain and all there's so much we could talk about there. And yet we all, I think, are kind of required just to function in our society to tune that stuff out to some degree or another, and to say, I can't, I live my life. I can't always be thinking about all of these consequences.
Yeah.
And so I think what's so interesting to me about ThredUp is it's an example of, it's a for-profit company. You've built a product, and it's a convenience company. It's a company where you want to make this behavior that I think all of us, if we sat down to think about it, would say, oh yeah, this is a behavior we should do, but in order to actually do it, it has to be so convenient that you actually think of it. You actually do. Exactly. There's so many things we all wish we would do, but if it's not convenient enough, you don't do it. And so like the idea that social change can come from a for-profit company actually trying to solve what is fundamentally a usability issue first and foremost. And then you just think about the contrast between, clothes that might have been questionably ethically produced, then like being overproduced so that they never get sold, they wind up in a landfill, or even worse, like clogging up someone's closet. And now it's like a source of anxiety and stress for them that they've got this overburdened closet, and then it has to be, they got to get somebody else to come in and Marie Kondo it to get the stuff out of it. It just, all of it. It's like all of these problems, just like are just the second, third, fourth order symptoms of the waste of overproduction and the lack of reuse. And just so that even like the engineer in me, just the antipathy I feel towards waste, the idea that could be eradicated is so satisfying, let alone all these other the social consequences. But I think, I'm curious what your experience has been like when people hear that you're a mission-driven company, your business with a social impact. For a lot of people, that conjures up activism, nonprofit. Like there's a lot of skepticism, I think, in the world that like, can really a for-profit company actually be a force for good?
Yeah.
You must have encountered that in your many, many conversations about it. Like, what do you think about that supposed conflict?
Yeah, I mean, I think look, what we're trying to do is break the mold, right? I mean, I think back to why how did I end up an entrepreneur, right? I think a lot of it was my innate interest in leading, right, and making a difference. I think comes back to I think I want to show the world, right? I think that's why like we started to work together, right? It's like show the world that you can actually build businesses that make the world a better place. And you can do it in a way that balances profits and purpose, right? That's what we're trying to do. And wouldn't it be great if we had systems in place that were designed to help businesses do the right thing? And I think for me, what I spend time now thinking about is, what would help us accelerate our impact faster? And I think like what I've come to is that the bigger ThredUp gets, the more impact like it can make, the bigger voice it can have. And so the question is like, what's the right relationship to getting that flywheel going faster? Because I think when ThredUp's a $10 billion or $15 billion or $20 billion company, the impact that we can make in the world is profound. And it's not just because of the amount of clothes that are running through the system. It's that I can show, our team can show other founders of like, hey, there is a path, right, to profits and purpose. And it's not always easy, but it can be done, right? And there are entrepreneurs out there that are doing this in many other places, but I do think we're a minority. And
it's an elite club, I think.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. But it's just harder, right? It's just harder. I had this I remember to your point about making an impact. We were on the IPO roadshow and we were meeting with this investor, and it was an ESG fund within a very, very large mutual fund. And it was such a funny conversation because this young guy said, he's like, yeah, but how do you give back? Like, as in right? Like the conventional thing is you have a for-profit corporation that for whatever or worse doesn't do a lot of good in the world. And so the way they contribute to society is they have a foundation or they do something that like does good in the world. And the implication of his question was like, that is the thing that matters. And I was like, the worst thing to be like, dude, like our existence does good. Every day we take stuff that was headed for a landfill and we recirculate it and put right. And but Eric, that is like a lot of what goes on in the investor community is that approach. And so I hope that we can at least break the mold a little bit and show people that intrinsically good businesses are good for bottom lines, they're good for the world.
This episode is brought to you by my longtime friends at Neo4j, the graph database and analytics leader. Graph databases are based on the idea that relationships are everywhere. They help us understand the world around us. It's how our brains work, how the world works, and how data should work as a digital expression of our world. Graph is different. Relationships are the heart of graph databases. They find hidden patterns across billions of data connections deeply, easily, and quickly. It's why Neo4j is used by more than 75 of the Fortune 100 to solve problems such as curing cancer, going to Mars, investigative journalism, and hundreds of other use cases. Knowledge graphs have emerged as a central part of the generative AI stack. Gartner calls them the missing link between data and AI. Adding a knowledge graph to your AI applications leads to more accurate and complete results, accelerated development, and explainable AI decisions. All on the foundation of an enterprise-strength cloud database. Go to neo4j.com/ERIC to learn more.
One of the things I've learned, very counterintuitive thing I've learned working with so many mission-aligned investors and companies, is that harder is actually easier in certain respects. So like by taking on the inventory, You made your life a million times harder. Now you're dealing with your logistics, and you're responsible for the thing. You've given up your software-like margins. You have to staff you have to take care of those employees. And I have to tell you, I mean, just like what?
Totally.
A lot of people listening are like, what a nightmare! You could have been asset light. Why did you do that? But you did it because not because you thought it would be fun, but because it gave you a huge competitive advantage. Because now you could actually solve the customer problem in a profound way. I've gotten to meet a lot of people over the years on your team, and I know just from meeting them, the level of talent that you can recruit, the level of morale and cultural alignment you have, because you have so the mission is so aligned with what's in people's hearts. You punch way above your weight from a recruiting perspective.
100%.
And you'll be able to attract these incredible investors. Like, talk a little bit about the advantages of taking the harder path.
Yeah, you've hit like one piece of this very important matrix. The recruiting, hiring, retention of employees has been extraordinary at ThredUp. And I genuinely think, look, there are lots of people in the world that, like, given the choice to work at a place that where they can like make money but do no good, and work at a place where they can make money and do good, like overwhelmingly, right? Like, people are going to want to work at the other place. And so we have had a huge recruiting and retention advantage from the very beginning. And it has allowed us in times, when things were hard, fundraising was hard, when the pandemic hit, right? All these things that were very difficult, people are like, okay, I know it's hard, but like, I love this company. I will do whatever it takes because I believe in the mission. And I think we have benefited so much from that, the quality of the people. I think the other piece on the investor side is, we've been able to surround ourselves with investors who matter, who care. Not all of them, right? But that, genuinely speaking, right back from the early days, Patricia Nakash, she was our investor at Trinity. Like, it was clear from our first meeting, she was interested in building, in investing in a company that was going to generate a great return. And she was like, man, this is really good for the world. And so when you align investors and employees, stakeholders, like all along this mission, I think you can do really powerful things. And I feel enormously grateful that that has happened, right? It's made my job easier. I don't have to convince people that, like, we're doing something that's marginally good, right? Or that we're not doing harm, right? I mean, a lot of founder CEOs have to stand up in front of their companies and convince them they're not making the world worse. And like, I don't have that problem. And I sleep really well at night.
Man, that is such an underrated attribute. I know a lot of founders, a lot of very successful founders, even, who are totally miserable.
Yeah.
But for that exact reason, it's the compromises you have to make are really brutal.
Yeah.
For people who've never experienced the kind of organization stakeholder alignment that you're describing, we don't even have language to describe it, honestly. It's such a special experience. And for people who've worked in an environment like that, invested in companies like that, it's still, as you say, the minority, but a powerful minority. To me, it's kind of like the best analogy I can think of. It's like the flow state they talk about for individuals. Like, if conditions are just right, sometimes we have these feelings. You get in this moment where you're superhumanly productive. The creativity is going. Everything is just right. You have that special feeling, almost a spiritual experience. This is like the equivalent of that flow state for an organization. And what's interesting about flow state is it's extremely difficult to get into, but awfully easy to get bumped out of it, right? The phone rings, one bad tap, just the tiniest thing can knock you out. So I'm curious, tell me about the measures you've taken, the way you think about protecting that culture, protecting that alignment from a world that, often doesn't understand it and sometimes is actively hostile towards it existing. What's that about?
I think, so one is that I don't think that, like, as a CEO, as a co-founder, that I can convince people of something that they don't intrinsically already believe. And so I think more than anything, it is, I'm tapping into something that's like deeply intrinsic to the people who work here and the people who work around our business that speaks to them. And so when things do get hard, and they've been very hard, right, over the years, I remind them of like what we're trying to do, the change we're trying to make. And it almost, like, Eric, to your point, like, it just kind of like shakes them back to center. Like, oh shit, I shouldn't worry about that thing, because at the end of the day, like, my values, my principles are about like what I'm trying to do here.
Give me an example.
look, we've been public now for a few years. It was great for a year, and then the stock has not done as well over the last year and a half. Some of it that's our
Join the
fault.
club we have
Yeah. It's
quite the
another
collection of tech stocks. Yeah, exactly.
It's another elite club, but hasn't done as well as we would like. But I remind people that especially if you're a 30-something employee at ThredUp, I was like, well, were you planning to retire tomorrow? And the
This
answer is,
quarter,
well, yeah, of course not, right? I'm like, we want to do good in the world. You didn't come here to retire at 33. You came here to work on hard problems, work with smart people. And so I think reminding people of, hey, we didn't do this just to be public. That isn't the answer, right? And so just that's the example that I often tell people is I'm not going anywhere. My life is not complete with a high stock price. That's not why I exist in the world. It'd be nicer, but at the end of the day, I'm not sure I'd be any happier. And so that's sort of when I tap into some of that.
Talk about the IPO process. Just tell me about the decision to go public. You were a high flying private company. Life could be good. Being a high flying private company is pretty fun. Talk about the process of deciding to go public, and then tell me what have you noticed that's different before and after having an IPO?
Yeah, I think if you go back to the founding principles and impact that we're trying to make, it became very clear to me late 20 into 21 that we could make a much bigger impact in the world if we were a public company, right? You had not had any companies of our ilk that were really trying to do good in the world be public in a recent time frame. And so to me, it was an opportunity to accelerate everything we were trying to do, accelerate the impact, accelerate the business, accelerate the quality of our employees. And so I thought about the IPO process as an acceleration of everything we were trying to do in the world. And I remember having these conversations about, well, why not sell the business? And I remember thinking look, I would sell the business if I believed that was actually going to help me make a bigger impact. Mm-hmm. And so if I could be nested inside some large company that was going to give me the freedom to make the biggest impact possible, inspire the world to think secondhand first, sure. I don't have religion about one way or the other. But I think in those conversations, it became clear that the number of companies for whom we could be a part of that would let me do that were probably very small. And so the IPO process ultimately became about accelerating what we were trying to do. And then, so that's kind of on the sort of core fundamentals of the business, right? And the business was working. We were executing our plan. The other piece is that, as Fred Wilson, I think said, 15, 20 years ago, you kind of go public when you can, and you sort of take your chances on the field later. And I remember him, I guess it wasn't, so I remember reading the blog post when Etsy went public, because people really had a problem with Etsy didn't perform quite as well, or blah, blah, blah. The IPO wasn't as great. And I just remember it's always stuck with me. Fred's like, everybody should shut up. You go public when you can, and let's take the long view, right, on Etsy and the good they're trying to do in the world. And so that always stuck with me. And I was like, okay, well, look, there's a moment in time when we could do it. We could do it effectively, and let's go do it. And so those were kind of the two conditions of the IPO process.
If someone's thinking about going public now, any advice you'd give them? Anything you would do differently if you could do it over again, or anything you think was really important that you're glad you did?
I think that the going public has made us such a better organization, right? The rigor that around what we're trying to accomplish. We're just a better organization everywhere. I think that the downside to it is that there's a lot of if your business is more volatile than you would like, and I would describe volatility as I was with a couple of founders yesterday, and we were talking about how their quarters shaped up. And I can't talk about our quarter, right? But they were like, oh, it was a little bit better or a little bit worse. And the guy who said it was a little bit worse, I was like, that's the reason why you don't want to be public just yet. If you cannot predict that with certainty, you just get punished for these things, which I find immensely frustrating. I think the amount of brain damage that exists in the earnings process is extraordinary. And if I could write it all over again, since you asked, right? Or didn't ask, right? I don't know why we don't just tell people what we think is going to happen. And then like we either do it or we don't. But this like consistent game theory that goes on in the public markets drives me bonkers. And so I would tell founders, like, if you don't want to like deal with that kind of brain damage, you should stay private. But on the other hand, like it can create enormous opportunities for you.
You've struck me always as having a very long-term approach.
Yes.
The research shows having a philosophy of long-term thinking is, it's ultimately what's required to have sustained performance over long time horizons, and to have the kind of cultural alignment that you have to be able to resist, the brain damage of quarterly pressures and the guidance games, and just like the number of distractions available, especially to a public company, that can pull you away from performance is immense. So just talk about like where does that kind of long-term generational scale impact like bug come from? Like how do you experience that personally, and what steps have you taken in the company to make sure that the company is focused on the long term?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's these loops in this conversation, right? It does come back to being mission driven, right? And I think when you're mission driven, you're optimizing for a long term. You're optimizing for a long.
They're inseparable. Can't have one without the other.
And so I think part of it is just my long term thinking is I do really believe in the mission, and so it's easy for me to take a 10, 15, 20, 25 year view. I think the other thing is when I look around at entrepreneurs who have run businesses for a very long time, right, with singular focus. I think about like Reed Hastings at Netflix, right, who 30 years of running Netflix, and I know Reed a little bit, and we've like talked a little bit about this, and he's just like, look, this is where I have passion. This is like what the mark I want to leave on the world is this, and retiring or doing something else is like not the mark he wanted to leave on the world, because that's an incredibly like gifted, talented person who could have done extraordinary things, right? But he was very passionate about a handful of things that he wanted to get right. And so I think a lot about that, right? If I were to think about doing something else, I don't know if I would have like the passion that I have for ThredUp. I mean, our business is so complicated that it's so much fun. Like the problems are so great, which makes the opportunity so great. And I laugh when people, like think about trying to like compete with us, because I'm like, when people are like, oh, I'm thinking about doing it, I'm like, good luck, good luck, right? And I see startups that compete with us today, and I'm like, I even said to founders, I'm like, look, I just want you to know, like, I want you to be committed to this thing for 15 years.
Yeah.
It's like, that's how long it's going to take for you to play catch up. There's just something about the mission piece, the joy I take in the work, the quality of the people. And I would say one other thing, which is around mission and is that I also get to have like incredibly insightful, powerful conversations all the time, right? Like I wouldn't get to have the opportunity to do this podcast, right, if I weren't doing something that was like making a difference. Mm-hmm. And I get invited to all sorts of like cool things, and I get to hang out with super smart people because of the work that I'm doing. And I don't want to underappreciate that, because I do actually feel really lucky about the places I get to go. Sometimes I'm like, people want to talk, right? Like congressional committees call and they want me to like weigh in on stuff, and I'm like, really? And then I get invited to sort of interesting things, and it's not because I want to be with the cool kids, but the intellectual stimulation of it is incredibly enriching for me. So,
gotta love the work itself, or you can't sustain it.
Absolutely.
It's another such a great example of the harder is easier thing, because investors are always looking for a moat. But I've found that the most powerful moats in the world are businesses where like they just make you want to cry contemplating doing them. They're so hard, and the pain is so immense, and you have to solve this like huge number of problems. And if you're the kind of person and you have the passion for the mission such that, chewing on the glass of solving those problems like is worth it to you, actually you start to enjoy it after a while because you care enough about the outcome. That is hard for anybody to replicate. And I think there's a lot of businesses that in theory should be vulnerable to competition, but just the complexity and the pain of it, it's too hard. And so you get this huge competitive advantage also from doing something extraordinarily difficult.
Well, and I think it's the combination of the hardness, the competitive advantage piece, with the quality of the people who are still at the helm.
Yeah, those things are definitely linked.
Right? Because it's like, so
point.
if there were a bunch of monkeys running ThredUp, right? Like then like maybe you can compete. But like when you combine just like rigor, attention, passion at the top with those deep competitive advantages, like that is a recipe for companies to be very successful over time. And they're obviously linked, but I think that's why I think founder-led companies, I think the data shows, I mean, I don't have it in front of me, but I think the data shows
clear, yeah.
they're more successful, right? Like over time. And because there's something about founders and employees working together on the hardest problems.
You made the decision to list ThredUp on the long-term stock exchange.
Yes.
For which, of course, I was very excited when you decided to do that. I really appreciate it. So first of all, thank you. But just talk a little bit about the decision to do that and how it's turned out so far.
Yeah, so I remember, and I don't remember if I've shared this with you directly, but I remember learning about the long-term stock exchange, and I remember even where I was on the street.
Wow!
So I was in front of our office on Sansom Street in San Francisco, and I'd read an article, I think in the Journal, about this thing that Eric Ries was working on. I was like, and we had only met briefly by that point. I'm like, this is so smart, because I was deep in a mission-driven kind of moment where I was like, this is the kind of stuff we need because markets are broken and everything is very short-termy. And so I remember back then thinking like, boy, this is a crazy idea. It's a great idea. Man, it sounds super hard. But like, I was like, but that Eric guy, he can do it, And obviously you had your twists and turns, right, along the way. And so I think when we came back together, and really the team kind of like came to me and was like, hey, we're thinking about this thing. I'm like, well, I've been thinking about this thing for years, right?
As long as it's existed, basically, yeah.
Yeah, dormant in my brain. And so I was very excited about the sort of principled approach for it. And so it's been really positive. I think though, for you, I'm curious how you're feeling about it. Is it's one of those things that's just going to take time. And the capital markets are wonky right now. But I think more and more companies will get there. And if I take the long view, which I do, are there going to be lots and lots and lots and lots of companies dual listed on LTSE and NASDAQ or New York Stock Exchange 20 years from now? Unequivocally, yes. And I'll be super proud to have been like one of the first. And so I like, from a leadership perspective, like I'm thrilled about it.
Oh, thanks for saying that. And to answer your question, it's really interesting. I've noticed a real disjunct. I was actually, just before we were recording this, I was on Zoom with a CEO of a really awesome company, public company, big company that every single person listening to this knows who this person is and knows their company. Very, very, very cool entrepreneur. And when I talked to someone like that and I explained about LTSE, he was very positive about it. And I was explaining the progress that we've made. Civilians, people who don't know the system and how it works, always ask me, how come it hasn't happened faster? Why hasn't this happened? Or when's that happen? But people who are in it, the CEOs I talked to, it was just like, he's like, that's an incredible amount of progress. It's like far more than I would have thought possible.
Yeah.
And that honestly, like, talk about hard business, because people view what we're doing as impossible. Yeah. Any progress is unbelievable. We're supposed to be dead 20 times over. And believe me, people have tried to make it so. So, I get it. So first of all, thank you for believing in it. But I think also what you said is absolutely right. That if you zoom out and take the long view today, in our kind of degraded understanding of capitalism and what we're doing, we think that being exploitative, taking advantage of your customers and employees and your investors, like that's what it means to be ruthlessly efficient. And that's the source of competitive advantage. And there's just this new breed of companies that are proving that that's just not true. Every time you do that behavior, you're creating a liability that some startup, I was talking to a CEO that I was like, some startup, every time you do that, some startup in the world is high-fiving. You just created an opportunity for them to come in and compete with you. And the companies that truly are ruthlessly efficient are the ones you really don't want to compete with, are the ones where everything's aligned and they've really taken the harder path. Like, that's ultimately where the returns are, because that's where the competitive advantage is. And so, I thank you for being one of the avatars of that way of thinking. I do think 20 years from now, whatever happens with LTSE, we'll see. What it depends on we got to execute. We got to earn it. But I think as a society, we're going to look back and say, wow, there was a moment there when people had a very confused understanding of what business is. And we're so glad we got through that adolescent phase. We have a more mature perspective. We're having better social consequences, but more importantly, we're actually being more profitable. We're making more money. The returns are superior.
Yeah, I look. As I mentioned earlier, like I was a history major as an undergrad and studied a bunch of philosophy, and I think there's something about my appreciation for sort of the arc of history and like how these things change over time that for whatever reason I'm very comfortable thinking about the world in much larger segments of time, right? And yes, we got to run the day to day, but I think sometimes when I think about, hey, the mark I want to leave on the world or the mark this company want to leaves on the world, I'm able to sort of contextualize that over like how change has really happened over the last few thousand years, right? And how these things take a lot of time. And I don't know if you've like read this Dawn of Everything like tome that's out there.
When you were talking about, I was just thinking about that book,
Yeah,
actually, which is, if those who haven't read it, we'll put a link in the show notes.
Please do, right?
Yeah.
It just is a reminder of like these things and like what we think we know about how history actually evolved. There's so much conjecture there. And so it's thought-provoking in that, do we really know, is what we really think we know actually true, right? And I think it asks some really important questions. And then it's just a reminder of the arc and of how long these things take. And so there's something about the fact that I'm reading that and I've read that informs how I think about LTSC and how I think about ThredUp.
One of the things that I really took away from that book is every civilization, no matter how small, from the tiniest city state up to the largest empire, every civilization, and really every organization, if you think about it, it's like a little bubble of utopia. Like it's a tiny little, spaceship. It carries its own environment in it. Yep. And it's an attempt to show what the relations between humans should be. If an organization is super hierarchical and there's subordinates who are mistreated, that's a view of human nature and what is best. I've talked to people who run law firms. Law firms are notorious for, all the power at the top and the subordinates, climb this ladder and the brutal churn. And that's viewed as the way that it ought to be done. And then you have other companies, think about like a holacracy where everyone's equal. You have other organizations that are very performance oriented, others that are engineering oriented, sales oriented. You have organizations that are basically just bureaucracies designed to perpetuate themselves. You have ones that are outright total frauds, not to name any names, but look at the headlines of late, we got a few. And so the idea that human evolution, human society has just, it's almost in our nature to experiment with these forms. Like, to me, that opens up the space of possibilities for the kinds of companies that we could run. And I talk to founders about this a lot. We don't often get into the dawn of everything, but we talk about, because I feel like founders especially are told by the gatekeepers of our current society that there's only one best way. And they have to conform to this very narrow idea of what a company should be structurally, culturally, how the relationship with investors, what it should be. Talk a little bit about how you felt like bucking that trend. You do things very differently. You have a very different culture. You've had a different philosophy. You've gone against the grain multiple times. You've pivoted away from thinking about going back to the asset light conversation, right? Yep. Pivoting directly away from the conventional wisdom at multiple moments. And yet you've had this incredible success. It kind of puts the lie to the conventional wisdom in the first place. But just, tell me about like how you've explored that sense of possibility. And as a history major, like, how do you think about the little bubble of utopia you've created for ThredUp?
Well, I think this like notion of like how we've bucked the trend is, I think, taking like a first principles approach to everything. And
explain what that means.
Yeah, just, first principles thinking is, as I sort of interpret and understand it, is just like forgetting about like the way the world is supposed to work and asking yourself like intrinsically, like how should a company focus, or how should somebody operate in a world that doesn't have all those sort of constraints and sort of baggage, right, around sort of the way the world has been designed. And so when we think about first principles, we've thought about everything from, in the earliest days of ThredUp, we decided to build remote work and out of the office work, like into our regular rhythm. And it came from, during the week, this was like in the early days, 2010, 2011, I would not come into the office certain days because I was highly productive at home, right? I was like, I'm not going to go to the office. I have to crank out all this work. I would go to a coffee shop. I would get highly caffeinated and I would crank through stuff and I would be wildly productive. And so we then experimented with, okay, well, what if that's so good for me, right? And I think this is sort of the humanity part where I'm like, where I think you could go one of two ways, which is you could be like, well, that's really good for me. So all of you other idiots, like you should all keep doing what you're doing.
I was just going to say that's actually a very common pattern.
Yes. And so I was like, but if this is so good for me, why would I not like give all of my team like that same opportunity? And so, but right, I think this is where it becomes sort of iterative. So we started with, okay, well, Fridays will be work remote days.
Mm-hmm.
Terrible idea. Because work remote Fridays means people work like a half day because we just cannot resist the temptation to go to Tahoe a few hours early or catch an earlier flight or all the other things we convince ourselves, we rationalize away as okay. So it's like, okay, well, how about we move to Wednesdays, sort of hump day right in the middle. And we did that for a long time and for years. And then I surveyed people. I said, hey, tell me about how you're using, and we called them, this is very important, we called them maker days. And so the idea of a maker day was that there could be no meetings. It was to make stuff. And the thesis was, I want you to solve the hardest problems at ThredUp. And my belief is that the hardest problems at ThredUp are not going to be solved sitting in meetings. And so find time to focus your energy. And I got consistent feedback after a few years of people were like, man, I love maker days, but you know what I'd be able to do if I had more than one? I was like, oh, that's interesting. And so, right, so we moved to a Tuesday, Thursday maker day schedule. And we ran that for years and years and years. And I think it was some of the most creative and highly productive time, of the company. And then as we fast forward, and I'll sort of keep it brief, as we fast forward in the pandemic, instead of laying people off, we actually did a 20% furlough. And so, but the furlough conversation was, hey, look, the world has rapidly changed and we all have different obligations. Like, I don't want to lay people off because we still have a great company to run. So we're going to do a 20% furlough, but I'm only going to ask you to work 4 days a week. So there's a quid pro quo there. And people loved that, right? Especially as the world started to open back up. And so as the world started to open back up and we kind of lapped a year, I said, look, you know what we're going to do? It seems like we've been able to get everything done we've ever wanted to get done on 4 days. So I'm going to take the salaries back to your full-time salaries, but we're going to keep a 4-day work week. And we have been, I think, pioneers. I mean, there's obviously been other people who've done this, but we weren't very public about it early, but very early around the 4-day work week. And so now you have a Tuesday maker day, right? So we come into the office Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, Tuesday maker day, and a 4-day work week. And because the second thing on a first principles basis thinking is I deeply, deeply, deeply believe that happy, well-rested employees are highly productive and highly insightful. And I just don't believe that at the end of the day, like the biggest inventions, the biggest innovations come from just grind out hours. And so that's the way we run the business today. And I think, and I feel like it's working.
It's one of the ways you can tell if an organization actually believes that their success depends on creativity versus just rote. If they actually believe the work is hard, they actually believe human creativity is needed. The companies that think they're going to replace everybody with AI tomorrow, really like you can tell. And the way that the tell is always like, do they have the actual support systems for human beings to be well rested, to do creative work or not? And again, it's like such the counterculture to what we have today, where people think being hardcore is to treat people like crap and then, make them work tons and crazy hours. And, I learned this as an engineer in the early days, like the code you write at 4 a.m. on a multi-day death march, not only like you may as well not have written, you're worse off having written it. It's just creating problems for yourself down the road. It's not hardcore. It's actually stupid. And what's hardcore is to work in a sustainable way that is highly productive. But I got to ask you, because I know there's plenty of people who are encountering this idea for the first time right now, 4-day work week, the data is in. The experiments have been run, but people have a really hard time believing that a company could be as productive in 4 days as they are in 5 days. It's like, I think maybe there's a cognitive dissonance. You'd have to admit how wasteful our normal work weeks are to accept this. But just like if I was skeptical,
yeah.
like, what's the evidence? Are you just some softie who doesn't like people working hard? Like, just explain to me honestly. Like, I know there's somebody listening right now. It's just like, I can't believe their stock price would be higher if they were or whatever, like nonsense people think. Let's just get right to it. Like, how do you know? How do you know that's working?
So look, I think part of it is you have to have a point of view on what's productive. So I'm guessing, Eric, to your point, we probably write fewer lines of code. I'd probably stipulate to that, right? We probably write better code that serves the customer better because we have a point of view, right? And whether that's REST or insight or whatever, that helps us make better decisions. And I just fundamentally believe that, like, at the decisions that every employee makes, right, the insight they have about how to serve the customer better, is the most powerful thing. And so, I think the other way to think about productivity is the company unit producing in aggregate better outcomes on behalf of the customer. And let's loop back to employee recruitment and retention. So now you've got a mission-driven company where people are well compensated with this incredible, like, work-life balance schedule. Those are a recipe to have the most talented people on the planet, right? You're like, wait a minute, I get to have it all? Like, that is a recipe for really high beta sort of outcomes. And so I think that part is also important. And so I think about it as the stew of activities that we put together. Is it creating something that's really, really tasty? And I think it is. And also I think we all know the companies that work 6 days a week, and I some of them are potentially producing superior outcomes, but I don't believe all of them are, right? And so my guess is that there are 4-day work week companies out there that are underperforming, right? I just don't think I have one, And so look, am I prepared? Am I prepared to go back to 5 days? Yes, I've told everybody, like, look, we have to prove that it works, and it's on all of us to prove that it works.
Yeah. I think that's really an important subtlety. That, like, you have to be an extremely performance oriented culture for that kind of thing to work and not be the result.
And I will say one, like, side note, which is, have you ever worked a Saturday in your life?
Me? Oh yeah.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, ask any founder. What are you talking about?
Yeah, right. But, like, most high quality employees have worked a Saturday, and so we have a 4-day work week. But I can assure you, through no obligation, people will put in a half day on a Friday, right? And it's not because they have to, but when I talk to people, the psychology is like, it's different.
It's different.
It's just
your
different.
choice.
Like,
it's your choice. Yeah.
It's your choice, and it doesn't start and stop on a fixed window, and so it feels different. And I think there's power in that freedom.
You've been a pioneer of using AI in your business. Tell us a little bit about the role of AI at ThredUp.
Well, I think that the AI, so I've been public recently about, I think AI is underhyped. I think a lot of people think it's overhyped. I think it's underhyped. I think for us, because of the unique nature of the problem we're trying to solve, this incredibly long tail of products, brands, search is a problem, fit, consumer preference. At any one time, we've got 4 or 5 million unique items on ThredUp. I think AI,
just identifying what you have must be such an interesting challenge.
Yeah, so identifying the products, categorizing them, helping users find them, all those things, I think AI disproportionately benefits us relative to, like, a traditional retail experience, right? And the best example I can give you is that we've been working on search at ThredUp, and search is, right, like, it's a huge problem, like search and discovery and getting consumers the most relevant products. We've been working on search for 7+ years. We built a new search product on top of some OpenAI, open source software in about 6 weeks. And we got the search in the 6-week build to be on par with the search in the 7-year build. So I'm oversimplifying a little, but, like, that scale is just extraordinary. And so I think there's so many things that I'm excited about in AI, and maybe you'll have me back on the podcast in a year and I can talk about all the cool stuff we've built, but I'm excited for that.
I'm looking forward to it. That's going to be really fun. You mentioned in one of your earlier answers that part of this new movement, thinking about the purpose of business, the structure of business, is also thinking about the role of government.
Yeah, I think that government, if you look at industries that that had some like negative, externalities. You look at tobacco, you look at coal and oil industries. You look at gas guzzling cars, right? Just to pick sort of on three, or you look at record labels and how
Mhm.
we think about
Yeah, how
limits for
artists have been
teens and
treated. Yeah.
stuff like that, right? Like rate, yeah, like there is always been a role of government in sort of like stick and carrot around how to make the consumer experiences better, how to remove these negative externalities. And I think, putting warning labels on cigarettes, like that did more than anything else, right? To sort of change the shape. I think adding tax credits for solar panels and electric vehicles, credits to build battery plants, and all these types of things that I think helped usher in a more just and sustainable future. I think the same thing can be true in fashion, which is one of the most polluting industries in the world. And so there have been two bills in Congress, one the Made in the USA Act, one the Americas Act, that have been introduced just in the last few months that I think really speak to what's the role of government in helping build a more circular, sustainable fashion. And so I'm a big believer in the role of government, and we'll see whether government can get something done, in this vein. But it does feel like it's something that has bipartisan support.
One of the things that's come up on this show in a couple episodes is people think about the relationship of government to business as kind of like government sets the rules and then business does whatever they can within the rules. And hidden in that framework is this premise that as a founder, as a company, as a manager, as a CEO, as a leader, we should want to do whatever we can get away with.
Mm-hmm.
But when you talk to actual leaders who actually think long term, none of them think that way. They think that's a bizarre. If you call out the hidden assumption, they think it's really bizarre. So I
Yeah.
kind of feel like part of this new movement is trying to decide what should we as leaders want to do? What ought we to want for our organization? Does
Yeah.
that resonate with you?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like imagining like what the world should be, right? Versus like
Hmm.
what we can get away with.
Hmm.
And I think, again, I think that's where mission-driven organizations, long-term stock exchange companies, right? Like companies with that perspective, we're trying to shape the future versus just figure out a way to make money, in the near term and to take advantage, right? And it's sort of breaking the boundary towards sort of exploitative capital versus sort of creative capitalism. And I think there's something in there that I think is really powerful. And I think that's what you and I are trying to do. And that's probably why we get along so well.
I think that, yeah, exploitation is a vulnerability. It's a
Yeah.
liability. We gotta teach people that that's true. I feel like I got to ask you about the resale report you guys just put out, just because you just had, well, at the time we're recording this report just came out. It was full of tidbits that, I don't know the secondhand market that well. And I don't, fashion is not an industry that I follow closely. So to me, it was full of really interesting tidbits. The one that really caught my eye, and a book of you obviously talk about a lot of it, but it was a bit where it said that it was like a generational thing. There's like
Yeah.
Gen Z people who are becoming, I can't remember the phrase you used now. I think you said something like resale natives.
Yeah.
And that really caught my idea. Like there's so many, talking to companies, you're seeing these generational shift trends, like really with Gen Z,
Yeah.
a lot of behaviors that we've taken for granted are turning over. Anyway, just talk about the resale report and kind of what you're seeing in the market.
Yeah, I mean, this resale report is something we put out back to first principles. We put our first report out 12 years ago. And I remember putting it together with Karen Clark, who was the original person who worked on it for many years. And she was like, is anybody going to read this? And I was like, not today. I was like, but I bet 10 years from now, it'll become like something. And she's like, I don't know, James, maybe. And, but like taking the long view, I was like, well, look, nobody's putting together like an industry standard report. Why not us? Right. And, so fast forward 12 years later, it has become the standard for what's happening in the resale industry. And I think there's a number of things that come out of it. One is sort of the growth of our market and broadly what's happening. Resale is growing 3 times faster than traditional retail, and that's a big number, right? And so you're starting to see all these consumers move into resale. And your point about the generational thing is that what's become obvious to us is that resale is not just a young person's game. And yes, it is like young people play this game, but everybody plays this game. And I think the power in the industry is that it's teens, it's 20 somethings, it's 30 somethings, it's 40, right? All the way up to boomers. And I think there's real power in a movement that transcends generations. And I think that's what gets me excited, because, many years ago, I always wanted to believe that a kid who grew up, and I hope your 10-year-old, right, who grows up in a house where, hey, there's secondhand product coming in, right? There's a ThredUp polka dot clean out kit in the house, that like somehow it seeps into their brain that secondhand is cool and powerful, and that over time it becomes, helps us realize our mission. So anyway, that's the point of the report, and it's got some juicy stuff in it.
Yeah, we'll put a link in the show notes. Frankly, the market is so much bigger than I really understood, and the rate of growth is really phenomenal. Yeah, I learned a lot from it. So I will hopefully people will read it. Can we do a lightning round of just a couple things?
Yeah, I love it.
We didn't get to do. Okay,
do it.
All right. Lightning round is my favorite part of the show, because I get to ask just about stuff that I learned in my research and quotes that I've heard, things I've heard you say over the years. And so we'll just do as many as you got time for. Okay. First of all, we didn't get to talk about the 27 rejections you got from when you're raising money for ThredUp. But just, I love that story so much. And just like talk about, I know you've talked about how that like really created a lot of resilience in you. And that's kind of been a theme of our conversation, is all the different setbacks like build up resilience. So but talk about like actually how it felt to have 27 rejections.
Oh, it sucked, right? I mean, it really sucked each time. And it sucked less and less each time, because what I realized was that I was talking to the wrong people, right? Or the pitch was wrong. And so after I got over the, tail between my legs part of the experience, it built me up stronger, right? And so I think that failing fast, right, was helpful. And I think the two takeaways I would share. One is that you can never convince an investor to say yes if they're a no. So stop trying, right? So the implication is you got to find people who are going to be able to get to yes. And so as an entrepreneur, you got to figure that out earlier, because I probably shouldn't have talked to 20 of those people the first time. And then the second is that in every conversation that you have where people tell you your baby is ugly, they're saying something small and insightful for you to find out. And the challenge as an entrepreneur is to figure out what that is, because 99% of it is useless, but there's 1% where you're like, man, that was right. I should have thought, and so I'm really glad that experience.
You've also said that all you need is one yes.
Yeah.
Related. Talk about that.
Yeah. I think Patricia Nakash at Trinity, she gets an enormous amount of credit for just being the first real big yes. But again, back to it is when I came in to talk about the company, we talked for a while, but the essence of it was, hey, I already understand this consumer problem. Just tell me how this business can work, right? And so I did not have to convince her of the problem. I did not have to convince her of the market. I did not have to convince her that like it could grow. I just needed to convince her that like we could figure out how to make the math work. And so that was the most powerful yes.
This is a favorite quote of mine. And I've heard you're a subscriber to the idea that you should have strong convictions loosely held.
Yes.
I think there's a lot of people who find that phrase confusing. Explain.
Look, I think as a CEO, as a co-founder, like you need to be able to bring people into battle, right? But you need to know which battles to fight and the strategy upon which to fight those battles. And therefore, like when new information comes to you, you need to be able to change course with conviction. And I think one of the things that I don't know whether it's a character trait or what, but there's something where I'm willing to be like, look, this is absolutely what we need to do. Get on the bus. We're going. And then like, oh shit. Like we've learned something new. Get off this bus. Get on this bus, right?
Get on the new bus.
And I think there has to be a humility to that, where it's like, look, I'm giving you the best bus I think we should get on. We might need a different bus. And I think the more you're humble and honest about that with folks, people are like, great, new information. Let's go do something else.
You said it's hard to see disruption when you're too zoomed in.
Yeah. Well, this is part of our conversation of like, you got to take the long view, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can't see it. You can't see the shape of Clay Christensen's disruption curve if you're zoomed all the way in 100x on the magnifier, because you can't see the shape of the line. And so I think it just requires like constant vigilance of zooming out. And I think it gets back to this arc of history question, this patience that allows you to be like, I think I see the shape of this curve different than other people. And then the other thing of being, maybe this is on your list, like you got to be contrarian and you got to be right. And so like, you know, you don't need to be right.
It's an Andy Radcliffe-ism.
Yeah, like you don't need to be right all the time, but like you gotta be. If what you're working on is consensus, nobody will care. I don't think anyway.
I think we were talking about this sometime. I couldn't figure out where I had heard this from you. I hope I'm not misattributing it to you, but I've thought about it often. You talked about we're going to have a circular fashion future.
Yeah.
Well, I'll let you explain. What does that mean? And how would it be different if we actually lived in that world?
Yeah, I think that the circular fashion future is the same way like we're going to have an electric car future. Like, I just think it's going to be so obvious. Like 10 years from now, like you're going to shop from a brand and you're going to ask the brand like, yeah, and then how do I give this back to you? Like, what's the take back program? And like, it's going to be the expectation that like everything is circular.
You just throw it out when you're done. Yeah.
Yeah. And like renewable in the world. And the same way, you know, as we've talked about recycling, I just think it's going to be obvious. And so I think what we're trying to do is prepare the world, prepare brands for that inevitability. And now whether it's 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, we can debate the time scale. But I find it hard to believe that in the future that we're going to live in a world where we just make stuff, wear it, and put it in a landfill. It just doesn't seem like the future.
You know, you've got a track record of having said something's going to happen in 10 years, and then here you are. You've mentioned a few on this call. So I don't know, people should probably pay attention. Who says something's going to happen in the next 10 years? It probably is. You were talking about being a founder. You said you never shut your love of the company off.
Yeah. My wife sometimes wishes I would.
Sure. We can all relate to that, I'm sure.
Yeah, look, I live and breathe ThredUp. I love it. It's but I would say, Eric, what's changed is I don't love it in the way where like I'm obsessed every moment. I just like love it intrinsically, like because it's doing like good in the world. And so I think there's a distinction of like the founder journey where I'm obsessed and I'm working 100 hours a week to get it off the ground versus it's just always with me. And so so I love it in a way that I want to nurture it and I want it to be wildly successful. And I don't ever really turn it off. Like I'll be out in the world and I'll be like, you know, we could work on that. That's interesting, right? And I just think that's part of the founder DNA. And I think the minute you stop loving your company or the minute you start thinking about other projects to work on, I think that's the other sign, right? Like it all comes in, like, you know, seeps into us. We're like, oh, maybe I should work on that thing. I found I had to always tune those voices out for a few years. And so anyway, that's my take.
James, you know, I got to say thank you for taking the time to come on the show. Thank you for being a pioneer, for a leader, someone who thinks, you know, really thinks from first principles, try to figure out how we can, in this new elite club of companies, you know, be people who make a business that makes the world a better place. But that's not a punchline. That's not a joke. It's not ironic.
Yeah.
I really believe it. So thank you for all you're doing.
Thank you for having me. This was great. I really appreciate your time and the opportunity. So hopefully we'll do it again sometime.
James, thank you for coming on the show. Really appreciate it. James Reinhart, founder and CEO of ThredUp. Thanks for a great conversation.
You've been listening to The Eric Ries Show. Special thanks to the sponsors for this episode: DigitalOcean, Mercury, and Neo4j. The Eric Ries Show is produced by Jordan Bornstein and Kiki Garthwaite. Research by Tom White and Melanie Rehack. Visual design by Reform Collective. Title theme by DB Music. I'm your host, Eric Ries. Thanks for listening and watching. See you next time.